Journalism is about bearing witness, knowing that everyone wants to be witnessed. Everyone wants to be understood. Everyone wants to be fairly and accurately represented.
I'm delighted to welcome a truly visionary thinker to the podcast today. Amanda Little, writer-in-residence and a professor in the English department and the Communication of Science, Engineering, and Technology program here at Vanderbilt. Amanda is an award-winning environmental journalist and a fearless storyteller whose work brings together science, innovation, policy, and the human experience. She's the author of The Fate of Food, What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World, and Power Trip, the story of America's love affair with energy. Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity and discovery. My name is Sibel Raver, and I serve as the provost of Vanderbilt University. As a leader in higher education and as a social scientist, I believe that we can transform higher education for the 21st century. At my core, I am wildly curious about other people's work, whether it's in science, the social sciences, the humanities, or the arts. This podcast gives us the opportunity to break open new ideas through discovery and creative expression. Her reporting has taken her into oil rigs, monsoon zones, vertical farms, and beyond, always with an eye to the big questions. How do we adapt? What innovations will carry us forward? And how do we tell stories that move people to act? Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, Vanity Fair, and many others. She's also a gifted teacher, guiding Vanderbilt students in environmental journalism, opinion writing, and science communication. Amanda, you're also the founder of Kiddizenship, a nonpartisan media platform that empowers young people to engage in civics and politics with editorial leadership from Vanderbilt undergraduates. You bring this incredibly bold, interdisciplinary lens to every aspect of your work. I'm so thrilled to have you with us today.
Could you say that every day? Can I wake up
yes,
and just listen to that
every morning?
You are bold and
visionary. I know.
That was lovely. Thank you.
Good.
I am so happy to be here.
Love it. Your book, The Fate of Food, is a great place, I think, for me to start. It's such a compelling book looking at how we'll feed the world in the era of extreme weather volatility and drought. As a journalist, you're so gifted at shifting the reader's thinking into seeing a problem in a new way. Specifically, when I read your book on the fate of food, I was so intrigued by the way you opened my head up to seeing agricultural innovation rather than simply thinking about the nation's food production as a sector of the American economy that's filled with threat or volatility or high concern. You tell this story by introducing us to Chris and Annie Newman, two young, super creative farmers who are embracing technology as a part of, rather than as in opposition to, sustainable farming. And you report on ways that farmers are not, quote unquote, succumbing to tribalism, which I just found fascinating, as you say, in making stark either or decisions, and whether or not to use technology to support sustainable agriculture in ways that are really inspiring. You carefully lay out the ways in which farmers are mixing methods and approaches. Can you just give us a glimpse of that when you're talking to this apple orchard farmer, Andy Ferguson in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, about his intense and super difficult work of protecting his apple crops from this concept of super chilling, this idea of high weather volatility, using new technology? If you just give us a little bit of that as a way to enter into your work.
Andy, like Chris and Annie Newman, sees agriculture at a fascinating crossroads between old and new world strategy. Of all the industries, farmers are the closest to nature, he observes. We think of the elements traditionally as beyond our control, but we have to be proactive. We can't fight Mother Nature. She's the source of what we grow, but we can redirect her. Andy does not associate the extreme weather that's been plaguing his business in recent years. Hailstorms, early blooming, severe spring freezes, the odd summer drought, with climate change per se. I don't pay attention to the global warming debate much. There's extremism on both sides, he tells me. Heartland farmers in general have not expressed much concern about climate change, as a political issue anyway. When I push Andy to address the broad international consensus on climate science, he resists. That's beyond my frame of reference. I'm a farmer who utilizes crop science, not a scientist who farms. He allows that on my own farm, and in my own region at least, the conditions for farming are becoming harder to predict and less certain. He's determined to find ways to succeed within those new realities, and optimistic that he will. Plants adapt, Andy says, and so do we. That's probably what we as a human species do better than any other: create tools and adapt.
So great. So, I see you in that field, standing with him, talking about climate change and talking about severe weather and talking about whether any of those things are real. And I love that he takes you into a completely different place, which is that rather than getting caught in a large political debate, he's so solutions-oriented in ways that I think open that whole area of inquiry or question for me as a non-specialist, I'm not an agricultural researcher, to an array of solutions that I didn't even know existed.
Thank you. That was so beautifully said, and I'm so grateful for your close reading of that passage. I mean, it took me a while to figure out that I needed to start this book in an apple orchard in Wisconsin on a fairly small scale farm. This was a book that took me to, I believe, 15 countries and 18 states. I spent 5 years researching the lands and the mines and the machines that were producing the future of food. And this is, the food industry is global. We're incredibly dependent and interdependent on production all over the world. And so I went from this tiny apple orchard or small, tiny cornfields in Kenya to this small-ish apple orchard to massive farms in Shanghai and Norway. And I just saw this huge gamut. But to me, starting in this field in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, with a 28-year-old, at that time, a 28-year-old farmer who had lost $1 million worth of his crops in about 5 minutes during a snap freeze in late spring earlier that year. And starting with this primordial fruit, right? The apple is so essential to so many of our diets. It is a common language. It's a common ground.
Such a symbol of goodness,
it
right?
It is a symbol of goodness and of temptation and of, and of conflict.
Right.
And moral ambiguity, right?
Yes. Deeply American.
It is, right. Deeply American. And it was important to me to start on U.S. soil, having just told this global story or having spent years doing that, and to take it out of the political and into the elemental. And Andy does that so well, right? I think so much of what my writing on climate and the environment over 25 years has really been about is trying to find ways to make accessible really complex issues. Take something that is a morally ambiguous conflict and bring us all into it in a way that feels immediate and personal.
And I love that you did that. Just to jump in for a second, Amanda, when you do your work, somehow there is this clear balance that you have between the science and the storytelling, right? You don't limit the detail of what you share with us, but you also don't take us so deep into what's happening at a cellular level in apples that are growing too quickly that we lose sight of Andy or lose sight of his losses. How do you balance that emphasis on the data, on the detail of the data, and that emphasis on storytelling?
That's great. And that was the topic of my investigative environmental journalism course with students this semester. So
great.
I'd love to share some of their amazing work with you because they do a beautiful job and they understand as, inherent, as really beautifully trained human storytellers through social media and so forth. This rising generation does such a great job of keeping stories personal, right? But I do that in this book and in all my work, this interplay between human storytelling and science-driven, explanatory, data-driven journalism. It's really, really important, especially with a topic that's as vast and complex as climate change is, to move us between the private and the public, the way this crisis is playing out in personal lives and on the public stage.
Yeah.
And also, at the narrative level, to move us sort of section by section in and out of the human story. What happened to Andy? How is he responding? How is he adapting? What are the costs? Yeah. On the personal level, what's happening to the plants?
Yeah.
And he set it up so beautifully in this passage. Thank you for selecting that, where he said, plants adapt and so do we. And, the history of 13,000 years of, human evolution has been a process of adaptation and responding to pressures and bringing innovation to bear as we do that. And so,
yeah, you talk about the centuries-old history of starting fires in orchards. I think it was in vineyards, right, to try to keep plants from being affected by freezes. That was something happening in Roman, periods of agricultural history.
Yeah.
But that it's actually not that effective. That he, as a thinking, science-based farmer, is rejecting that particular method and going for a different one, right? I love that you brought in that sort of historicist frame.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting in both the agriculture industry and in the energy industry, even actually in some ways in transportation, that many of the solutions that make the most sense are drawing on ancient wisdom. There's a real beautiful blend of technology and tradition on Andy's farm. He's bringing in these very expensive, high-tech frost fans at the same time that he's trying to go back to permaculture and agroecology and these old ways of building inherent sort of resistance and resilience into his fields.
That's so great.
Yeah.
I think from the outside, from a less informed perspective, we often think of those as opposing views, right? That there's somehow the permaculture person is not going to be the giant frost fan person,
right?
Right, and that there is so much more fluidity in thinking through the problem and the solution.
This is the central theme of The Fate of Food, is the third way, right? We have this sort of these warring factions in the discussion, really across many industries. Do we reject technology? Do we fully embrace technology? Are we going to engineer our way out of this problem, or are we going to go back to pre-industrial agriculture and, all have our backyard farms and,
which you tried, right?
Go Ma Ingalls, which, yes, I still am sort of trying to do that. And Michael Pollan and Alice Waters and others who have been really central to the sustainable food discussion have been great influences and mentors for me. But so has Silicon Valley. So have, a lot of people on the front end of the, smart tech solution. What is what does the smart future look like? And we see this in, energy, right? Even as we are trying to kind of pull ourselves away from fossil fuels, which is an ancient, the sort of primordial, elixir of subterranean fuel. We're going to sun, we're going to wind, we're going to the elements. And yes, there's a lot of really whiz-bang, high-tech IT that goes into it. But it is about a fusion of past and present and past and future, right?
Yeah.
It is about going back to ancient wisdom, to the elements themselves, and also considering all of the smartest technologies and innovative strategies we have on the table. But it was very hard for me to kind of sell that to a lot of my audiences, because whether I was talking to, Silicon Valley, or if I was talking to sustainable food audiences who say, thank you very much, get technology out of my food.
Yeah, right.
I don't want to engineer my way out of anything. I just want to,
I want to have the belief system I have reified and affirmed. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And you're saying, but you're both right. We can't do it. Technology alone won't solve this problem. Yeah. And nor will de-engineering or revisiting a sort of bucolic past
romanticized
that, by the way, existed when we had 3 billion fewer people on this planet, right?
No, it's great. And so I'd love to go there in terms of method, right? Because I think many of us want to be able to have that dialogue with people that we actually are wanting to learn from rather than be on the same sides with, right? So that notion that you are able to find a way to get in there and build trust with people to share both your curiosity, but also to elicit their expertise. When you go into the field to talk with the farmer or the oil rig worker or the engineer or the permaculture person, how is it that you build that connection, that they know that you don't have such a strong set of priors, such a strong set of a priori expectations, that they can really share with you what they know? How do you build that?
It's a great question, beautifully presented. I really, as every journalist I've ever known, struggle with this. It's very hard not to come into a conversation or a visit to an apple farm or a visit to a robotic farm in Shanghai without assumptions, without biases, with an open mind. This was a book, this was a process over 5 years of reporting that was really about changing my mind and being willing to let my mind be changed on issues that I found very threatening, like genetic engineering, right? GMOs. I came in with lots of assumptions about that. And I really came out thinking it was going to be essential to bring advanced breeding techniques, including GMOs, to the table as we
I've read
build.
Jamie Metzel's Superconvergence, right?
Yes.
Same level of
yes.
Had no idea, huge, major set of options that might actually provide a path, right?
Yeah. And the same is true even of some of these sort of post-food concepts of how we're going to get calories in, places either indoor cropping or some of these, food pellet style sort of, dystopian concepts of what food might look like in 20, 30, 50 years. I came in with a lot of fears. Food is a proxy for love. Was in my family. My mother expressed so much of her affection for us through food and food traditions. And so to think and to kind of present a reader with this notion, or a farmer with this notion that we are facing major disruptions and transitions in how we produce food and what kind of food we consume.
Oh, it's such a brilliant insight, Amanda, that, right? That the reason that it's threatening is because it is an implicit or nonverbal means of conveying love. I love that.
It is. Yeah. I mean, much more so than how we produce energy or how we transport ourselves from one place to another. I mean, food as a prism for the story on climate and a very, significant moment in disruption economically and environmentally. Understanding that through food and food production was a way of bringing climate into an intimate space, right?
Fascinating.
The topic of my TED Talk was the climate change is becoming a problem you can taste. Right. This is a kitchen table issue. This is something that is, intrinsic to our bodies, right? Yeah. It is a really important, from, a storytelling standpoint, important way of sort of bringing this into a private and intimate space in the conversation. But your question was, how do I talk to stakeholders in this story? As someone who's on the outside, as someone who's not a good food producer myself, who's not a particularly gifted chef, I don't have I'm not in a Silicon Valley startup. I'm coming in as sort of a flawed consumer who's having trouble living a virtuous vegetarian, 100% sustainable life. And I want to know, how do we build a 100% sustainable food system that is equitable and affordable and accessible, and it's not going to require us all to go live in Berkeley, California and eat $6 tomatoes, right? So I had to come to the table as someone who didn't know the answer and didn't know what that would take. And I even asked Michael Pollan and Alice Waters and some of them, how do we do this in a way that is really broad scale, large scale? Do we have to de-engineer all of industrial agriculture? Right. How do we do this on a grand scale? Yeah. And there just wasn't an answer. So when I sit down with Andy Ferguson or, one of the dozens and dozens of people I interviewed for this book, part of it was, number one, to remind myself I don't know the answer. So humility. I'm hearing a lot of willingness
to be really frank with someone about you not knowing the answer.
And to realize that I had to check a lot of my assumptions and my biases and my romantic notions of what agriculture should look like at the front door, right? Yeah. But also a real appreciation for what is essential to great journalism and what is the reason I love teaching it, especially to our students, is that journalism is about bearing witness, knowing that everyone wants to be witnessed. Everyone wants to be understood. Everyone wants to be fairly and accurately represented. And so showing up at the apple farm, at this tiny maize farm in Kenya, at the massive robotic farm in Shanghai, showing up and bearing witness and listening with humility and knowing I don't have the answer and getting hours and hours and hours of transcript and trying to let my mind be changed as I did that, bearing witness
it's
in
such
person.
A beautiful means by which I'm sure the people that you're speaking with feel that, right? A means by which you're communicating that level of trust, right? That you are trustworthy, that you're not going to misrepresent, that you're not out to misrepresent, that you're out to witness. It's a really profound way of framing that interview, that meeting, that encounter. And I imagine it takes a ton of time and a lot of patience and a lot of holding back where you're not actually doing a lot of the talking.
Well, thank you. It's definitely hard won. I think part of it is I've now 30 years into a journalism career, realized how many times I came into a story and whether I was willing to admit it to myself or not, wanted an outcome. I wanted there to be a good, easy answer. Yeah. I wanted, EVs to, take over, and I wanted solar to win, and I wanted, sustainable, accessible, affordable foods. And I just wanted it to be
a straighter shot.
I wanted a silver bullet. We all do. We all want something to reassure us, especially at a time of so much disruption. And I see this in so many of my colleagues, especially who've been covering climate change, because I've been writing about this since really the first IPCC report came out that made headlines in, early aughts in about 2001, I think it was. Do you want to
just give us the acronym breakdown?
Oh, thank you. Yes. International Panel on Climate Change. And that is, the body of thousands of scientists who've been tracking climate science for the better part of probably 30, 40 years, since the mid 80s. But it was part of the national conversation and the growth of the clean tech economy. I started out as an energy reporter. I moved into water and hydrology. I moved into agriculture and food, tracking the climate story through these industries. And if you talk to an early journalist, they have a lot of passion and conviction. And if you talk to an older journalist, they have a lot of passion and conviction, but the more you learn, the less you realize you know. And so there is a lot of learned humility over time. And it is the advantage that any seasoned journalist has over a young one. And you learn to kind of come to terms with how little you know, even as you have expertise in the area.
But somehow you don't leave the reader, you don't leave me as a reader at least, feeling at sea, right? You don't leave us with, well, we just don't know enough, which is always, while I appreciate the frank reality that things are complicated, always feels to me like you just left me at 2/3 of the story, right? I want enough to know where to go.
Yeah. And this is why, again, if you have the privilege of reporting a story across, many continents and with dozens of characters, and you have years to do it, you have, an arc of progress in your own understanding of something. And I came away with a real sense that this is very solvable, right? We can build a resilient food system that not only prepares us for and, helps us and endure through an era of environmental disruption, but also redresses many of the problems of our industrial food system that has been growing essentially since World War II, that's made it possible to triple human population on this planet. There's so much that was incredibly valuable. And that we dismiss about the, benefits of industrial agriculture. But of course, it had tremendous costs. Those costs can be redressed as we begin to, prepare for, this era of really unpredictable conditions for food production.
Yeah. And I love that you actually, in just mentioning World War II, you were using it as a historical, sort of benchmark in terms of timeline. But it also reminds me of the chapter on you using time with, defense industry expert on how to prepare a nutritious food for being out in the field, right? What inspired you to go in that direction, right? That was a chapter that I thought, I have not read any other books on food or sustainable agriculture or the future that pivot from the apple tree orchard to the meals ready to eat, test kitchen of a military research lab, right? So tell me, how did you keep your aperture that wide? What drew you to that nutritionist?
Thank you for reminding me of the kind of the grand arc of this story. The book actually starts out at a survival foods facility in Salt Lake City because I had done a piece on the prepper food industry, which was exploding, and actually in recent years, you won't be surprised, has grown even more. Yeah. And my brother, who is a climate scientist, a very well regarded and influential one, is a prepper. He has a basement full of foods. And my cousin, I had a lot of people in my life who were actually preparing for end of times and who are very informed people. And I was just going like, what?
What's going on?
Because I am a naturally both curious and optimistic person. I just am not inclined to prepare for end of times or disaster of any kind. Like I just don't think that way. But it was so immediate. And then I was tracking the sort of economics of the kind of survival industries. And that was very interesting to me. So the MRE, foods, which was the sort of source of a lot of the technologies in freeze drying and these kind of long storage foods, they're called, which are currently being developed in this prepper industry. They came out of, not surprisingly, the Army Natick Research Laboratory in Massachusetts. Right. So it was all sort of part of this bigger question of what does the worst case scenario look like? How do we, if we are going to have parts of our country, like the Southwest, for example, which is in, very severe drought pretty chronically and facing the whole lot, western half of our country is facing really significant water scarcity in the coming decades. And of course, whole regions of the world, like the Middle East, for example, are facing tremendous water scarcity. And so what does it look like if you have regions where you cannot get fresh, high nutrient, high flavor produce and foods? How do we deal with that? So as we try to figure out, okay, how do we do sustainable, resilient industrial ag for areas where you have good growing conditions or reasonably predictable growing conditions? What do we do at the same time if we have portions of the world that are just plunged into famine? So I had to look at that. That was part of the sort of, fullest extension of my inquiry.
I love that too, right? Because you're going from the, sweetest, chez panisse moment of thinking about the organic meal that is the highest sort of level of luxury or pleasure, right? To our scariest space of imagining, even if you weren't thinking necessarily about famine or drought, you might be thinking, well, what does a population do if there's suddenly an emergency like a huge fire, right? Yeah. Suddenly that sense that actually access to food is not just a matter of pleasure, but a matter of survival. That you told that story was so remarkable to me, and that you still came out highly optimistic, highly resilient, focused, highly solutions focused, right? That it didn't lead you into a grim sort of close.
There have been so many moments in human history where we have faced the impossible, especially around food, right? That was the necessity, that was the mother of invention of nitrogen-based fertilizers, right? It was, oh my gosh, we have over-farmed all this land, we've depleted the soil, we have,
lots and lots of
people to feed, and what are we going to do? Yeah. So, agriculture is such an interesting space because you see that creative adaptation happening time and again with these innovative responses. So history is a great indicator of the reasons for optimism that we can have right now, because we have found a way to sort of engineer solutions to problems as they become more and more urgent.
We adapt. Right?
And especially everyone has to eat, right? We don't all necessarily need cars, and we don't all even need electricity, but we all have to eat. So this was a way of bringing both a historical lens, but also, again, that really intimate personal lens of this matters to me. And I can see why the urgency of this issue has played to the advantage of the human species over time, because it matters to everyone so much that we've been incredibly creative about coming up with solutions. Right?
It's amazing. And did you always know that you wanted to be a journalist, Amanda? Did you always know that this storytelling capacity that you have to be able to hear so many different sides of a view of an issue and be able to present that in a way that doesn't alienate you from all sides, but in fact brings everybody into the conversation, right? Like you can imagine you might be a writer writing to an audience of one, right? But in fact, you're very, very brilliant, whether it's the Bloomberg opinion pieces or other outlets, that you bring so many audiences in, right? Did you know that writing was the way to do that? How did you get here?
Thank you so much for that very kind assessment of my work. Because I was not a person who grew up wanting to go into journalism or storytelling. I was pre-med, actually, when I went to Brown, or in my sort of first year at Brown. But my best friend and college roommate was the editor-in-chief of the independent newspaper at Brown. And she had, at that time, it was all printed, and she would have actual real estate that she needed to fill. And a piece would fall through, as it always does. And she would say, remember that story you told me yesterday? Write it up. I've got space to fill. And so she basically, I was her pinch hitter because I was a storyteller to one, because she was, the best storyteller I ever knew. And she and I just shared that. And so she basically made me put my stories on the page, because it was sort of a personal column, essentially, and then I came in as a features editor, and I owe it all to her. And she very tragically died 10 years ago. And I have been really doing this work with her in my heart and mind the whole time. She was an extraordinary, very high-level writer and reporter for USA Today, and she had a beautiful, huge journalism career. And I have no right to be here telling the story of my journalism career in some ways, because she was just, twice or three times the journalist I could ever be. But
I love that it grew out of a roommate, a peer relationship, right? That wasn't about pursuing an academic major. I think we often have this whole conversation about our students choosing the right major? Are they pursuing the right academic track? And it's fascinating to me that was a co-curricular, as we would say, but like a completely non-curricular, deep, passionate, wonderful thing.
Yes, I'm lurching my way through Bio 10, and she's going, write that story. And I'm going, wait, I think I might be better at this. But it was actually, I owe the kind of longer arc of my career to Barack Obama, of all people, because I started writing a column for the Village Voice early in my career in the late 90s. I kind of graduated into the dot boom, and I just could sort of call myself an expert. I was a tech writer really for the first 4 to 6 years of my career. But I started writing for Rolling Stone and writing about tech and the environment as I was sort of gaining more and more confidence and expertise in those areas. And I interviewed Barack Obama in the early aughts when he had been elected to the Senate for Rolling Stone. It was the first Rolling Stone interview. I put together 16 pages of questions for him for a 20-minute interview, because I was very eager and excited to talk to this rising star. I mean, we knew how great he was at that point, but it was kind of like, can he ever possibly fulfill everything that everybody is expecting of him?
He was in Chicago.
He was
young.
He was super young. We were in the empty campaign headquarters of his Senate campaign. And I asked him in that interview, and he generously gave me about an hour and a half when we had 20 minutes scheduled, because he felt so much for my, enthusiasm. But I said, how did you manage to share 1 million votes, 1 million rural Illinois voters who put Barack Obama in the Senate, also put George W. Bush back in the Oval Office? They voted you on the same ticket. You got conservative voters. How did you do it? And he patted my stack of 16 pages of questions. And he said, for the same reason that you will have an important career. He said, because I'm a storyteller. Wow. And story is the essential currency in politics. And I am so fortunate that I have a great story to tell. And it is the animus.
Amazing,
it is the
Amanda.
Animating currency in all industries, in business, certainly in academia. It's how I can compete with my students. iPads and laptops and phones and social media when I'm trying to engage them in the classroom. Everything about how we connect to each other is informed by story and great storytelling. And so he said, journalism is the most important career in many ways because you are learning the rudiments of and the essential elements of, very immediate, high-paced, smart, fast storytelling. And that's who I am fundamentally. Before I'm a politician, I'm a storyteller. And of course, we know that he published a bestseller before he was in the Senate, and he has done more of that since. So I called my mom up, who had still been trying to get me to go to law school or med school or business school, or would you please get a degree
so that you can
and would you just pick
safe,
a career
secure,
that
and
is
paid?
Yeah, that is like legit, because I don't even know what nobody's interested in journalism. And I said, Mom, Barack Obama just told me that I have the most important career.
I have it on good authority.
And yes. And so I'm sticking with journalism. That's that. So it was Olivia Barker and Barack Obama who got me to commit. And even then, it's a very entrepreneurial career.
Yeah.
Which is quite like academia, right? It's about ideas. I don't think of myself as an artist. I'm an artisan. I patch stories together through.
But you're shopping ideas in matter of days, right? I mean,
that's true.
My life as a federally funded researcher, right? I had years to figure out how to tell the story. Not only did it take years, as it did for you with the book, but collecting the data and then integrating the data into a tellable story, I had plenty of leeway.
Yeah.
But you work really, really quickly, right?
Yeah. It's bringing us back to that opening line from Andy Ferguson. It's, plants adapt and so do we. I mean, that journalism is great training, especially in this moment of very rapid change.
Yeah.
And because it is about adaptation, right? Like find a story, find a source, can't get to that source, pivot, find a new approach to the story. Yeah, find a way to build on sort of your previous story, your previous source, and find a new way to catch your audience if that last piece didn't hit and you didn't get it. You didn't
that wave
make
is crested. You might not be
it's
hitting
iterative,
the audience. Yeah.
And in the way that plant adaptation is iterative, and so, but it is very fast paced.
Yeah.
And so it is funny to me that I balance my career between journalism and academia, because academia slows me down in ways that I really appreciate. The hustle of journalism can get really wearing. And, academia is in a moment of really exciting adaptation and change. And
Indeed.
I love to be a part of that. I love to see how my kind of fast-paced hustle and adaptation in journalism is valuable in this space.
I think that's exactly right. And I'd love to come back to that idea of learning about fast pace from the next generation after we take a little break. Amanda, welcome back to the podcast, Quantum Potential. Such an incredibly interesting conversation about thinking about the role of journalism in lifting up and breaking apart the ways in which we think about a problem and seeing new solutions. I think one of those that you just mentioned is the power of a younger generation to see a problem in a different light or to use tools in different ways. And I think a lot about how much I have anxiety over social media like TikTok and platforms like TikTok because of their attention capture, because of the ways in which they seem to distract us. But you had this great way of opening things up again with the idea that students use social media, they use platforms to actually drive the storytelling, to actually take control of storytelling, and to actually engage in the nation's processes of whether it's elections or understanding how politics work through student newspapers, through debate, through ways in which they are holding civic fora for each other. You just came back from Seattle. You were just telling me as we started this, from a huge conference. And I want you to tell us a little bit about that, because I think it leads really well into this discussion about our undergraduates and student newspapers, not only your own experience that you shared with working on a student newspaper, but how empowering and exciting that might be going forward. So tell us about Seattle.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my favorite topic of conversation. I was at the Journalism Education Association Summit for 3 days and had the good fortune of being able to present this project I've been working on called SUN, the Students United News Network, and this national student newspaper I've just launched last month called the Sun Post, SUNNPOST.com. And we are publishing really high-level student journalism on civics and politics. It's a nonpartisan publication. We're publishing the best content from the top student newsrooms nationally, high school and undergraduate. And we launched this network that just within months, we had more than 100 top student newsrooms join us at in the Student United News Network. And it's just been a total thrill to see.
And you said thousands of students and teachers,
and at
right?
This summit there were 4,000 high school journalists, basically 15 to 18 years old, who were there with their faculty advisors who keep these student publications thriving and alive. And they're the great unsung heroes of our time, by the way. We should, if we can get to that. But I was just so inspired by the level of talent and the level of engagement. And it confirmed for me what I know, and is part of why I've moved from my climate storytelling really into this space of student journalism and civics. They're very closely connected, but I'm pretty deeply immersed in student journalism at the moment. They have a lot of climate stories to tell, and they're very engaged in that topic. But it confirmed for me that this is the best content generation of our time.
So I'm going to ask you to pause because you have this great set of phrases in a Politico article that you recently released. If you wouldn't mind just reading this part.
Excellent. Yes. Oh, this was a piece in my Bloomberg column.
Oh, Bloomberg. Sorry. Yeah.
And about the importance
student journalists
of
need a bigger seat at the table in 2024.
Yes. And it's about how young reporters are filling some of the gaps that disappearing legacy newsrooms are leaving behind, and how overlooked this problem is, and what an important moment it is to really bring value and attention and amplification to student voices.
Yeah, it's great. You say something like the breakdown of the American news industry is actually also a breakthrough, right? I love that this chance of sort of
we can only hope. Yes, there's a theme. Breakdown generates breakthrough, or can, and certainly we've seen that in the climate space and how those pressures are driving innovation. But it's true. In American news media, we know there's a tremendous crisis. There's a sort of free fall in the way that we're trusting and even generating news media with integrity. And so, I'm very interested in how Gen Z can bring talent to bear in this kind of void, right? So the passage you asked me to read begins. The American news industry needs young digital native talent. Sure, Gen Z's preoccupation with social media may seem more disruptive to journalism than beneficial, but many college journalists are using it discerningly and to their advantage. Emmy Martin, editor-in-chief of the Daily Tar Heel at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, oversaw the coverage of the campus shooting that was shared with millions by President Joe Biden, among other notable figures. This was published last year. The Daily Tar Heel's audience surged beyond the UNC campus and now reaches more than 63,000 followers on X, 43,000 on Instagram, and has more than 85,000 likes on TikTok.
I mean, I think it's just amazing to really understand that younger adults for whom we hope engagement in civic life is increasingly valuable, exciting, energizing, we're constantly debating, how should we be teaching that? How should we be thinking about that?
Yeah.
But you're really pointing to the fact that students are leading the way. There's not a lot of shaping that we necessarily need to do there, so much as supporting both the technical and the sort of the skill set of those young journalists, right? That,
yeah.
I mean, the vibe I got from the writing that you have is that actually students are well ahead of many older adults in understanding the power of social media to tell stories. And how can we really support and harness that in thinking about journalism rather than one-off entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, you said that better than I could, but I would push back slightly. I think they have this generation, and I see this in every new class of students I teach, every new incoming first-year class at Vanderbilt has richer, stronger, deeper, wider storytelling skills. They've been documenting the world around them since probably before they could walk or were pre-verbal, right? They've been these young, tiny documentarians.
Yes, the post, the selfie,
and they see
blog.
This. They literally have this lens through which they are interpreting the world. And that is a great advantage because they get the power of story, they get intimacy of story, that human storytelling that we were talking about at the beginning. But how and where are we inviting them into the rigor of research, to the importance of fact-checking, to the distinction between primary and secondary research? There's a lot of training that needs to happen to engage students in the power of bearing witness and bringing truth to storytelling and to understand that truth, and to receding as an observer rather than a shaper of opinion.
So great.
And that is tricky. It's difficult. I teach both opinion writing and, journalism at more objective, investigative journalism. And it's very interesting with this generation to kind of talk about the benefits of receding into that sort of humble posture as you bear witness to truth, right? And what it takes to convey that on the page. And so do you have to slow students down because is the first tendency to self-disclose, to tell my own story? Yes. Oh, yes. And by the way, they're so good at it that I love to hear their stories. But even in the best opinion writing, you are deeply listening. You are deeply considering other perspectives. And this is why I love teaching journalism and why I love especially engaging with this high school, early pipeline of journalistic talent, because they are willing to, learn and adapt and be sort of flexible. They have pre-partisan mindsets. They have a lot of more sort of plasticity in the way that they're perceiving. And, seriously, deeply considering what the counter argument might be is so much of the work I do with my opinion writing students, right? What is it to, persuade rather than shout at your audience? What kind of common ground does that require? What kind of common language do you need to, and sort of understandings? And again, humility do we need to practice to bear witness, to tell stories in a way that brings people together rather than separates them.
And do you think it energizes them in terms of civic engagement? Do you find your students feeling more hopeful or more empowered or more energized to move into the space?
Yeah, that's a great question, because what I say is you don't have to know the answer. I mean, the wonderful thing about getting older as a journalist and becoming sort of less certain about what's true and right and what I know to be true is that it takes pressure off of you as the storyteller. You can just see what's there and observe and share it. It's curiosity over certainty. And I'm taking that from Carlos Lozado's a great line that he shared when he was talking with students in the classroom. He's a New York Times columnist. And there's the curiosity over certainty is a big relief for students who feel like they have to know everything, right? And you have to have an Instagram post that is just like, here's my position on the Israel-Hamas crisis, or, you don't have to know.
Yeah.
You
very
do have
related
to be
to
curious.
Another of the speakers on this podcast was a scientist named David Yeager, who talks so much about how adolescents and young adults are struggling so hard for respect, or struggling so hard with their sense of worth in the face of others' assessment or others' attribution, right? So having to know everything versus being comfortable in not knowing. Right?
Yeah. And it makes for a better story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you have this is the villain and this is the hero and absolute right and absolute wrong. I mean, that's good marketing.
Yeah.
It's not good storytelling, right? Like leaning into the ambiguity of industry is partly right and partly wrong in this situation. And these people on the other side who are dealing with this problem wrought by industry are also right and wrong. And there's all kinds of gray area, and we're all trying to make sense of it together. It is, I think, very exciting to see students not only embrace the power of really balanced and inquisitive storytelling as opposed to opinion-forward storytelling, but also see that asking questions and asking right questions and showing up and bearing witness is a form of lived civics education.
Right.
When you go into a community or talk to even, someone on campus with an open mind and with questions first, rather than here's my monologue and my spiel, you are doing the work of learning that is civic engagement. That is really the skill that it takes for us to agree to disagree, to participate in democracy, right? So my kind of passion and love affair with student journalism right now is this is the way to modernize civics education, right? You invite students to go tell a story, to ask questions, to receive a range of different truths, and to try to sort of make sense of them with as much, integrity and respect as you can.
Super exciting.
And that is what it takes to be an engaged citizen.
And do you find that the coalition of student newspapers that you have brought together, that everyone is of the same mind in that respect? Or do you feel that you're having to kind of wrestle with, a very heterogeneous set of perspectives on certainty and storytelling versus persuasion, right?
Yeah.
Marketing versus leaving the question open. How fully does everybody believe in or is on board with that vision?
It's a really good question. And it's very different in collegiate journalism than in high school journalism. I think a lot of the content that we publish has a lot of opinion woven into it. It's harder to find observational and investigative reporting that's happening at a high level. It's very common to find amazing, passionate opinion writing on big topics, which is something that is true in student journalism now that probably wasn't true 10 years ago, because this generation is so engaged in this conversation about who we are as a nation and where we're going. So my work is to do more and more mentoring of students, to put them in the field, to give them the chance to be at their General Assembly meetings and at their Board of Ed meetings and doing community journalism that is doing that really deep observational inquiry-based work. And in this early stage of the Sun Post, a lot of what the low-hanging fruit of the best content that we're publishing is fairly opinion forward. It's not screed writing, and it's very responsible, and it's well researched. And certainly once we do edits with the students, it's very beautifully and respectfully argued. But how much does it take to get students into the field doing, not objective, because that is a word that is so fraught right now, but doing inquiry-based learning and inquiry-based writing. And they're interested in it. They're open to it. And that's why for me, just coming from this high of being with 4,000 really, really passionate student journalists, I'm like, yes, they're on board. They totally see it. But I do think they understand that the role of the free press and the role of free expression in this moment is incredibly important. Yeah. And that news media is imperiled, that there's a profound distrust. there is no future for American news media without a pipeline of young talent. There was a great quote from someone that said, there's no MLB, there's no Major League Baseball without Little League. So we need to cultivate the talent of this next generation. And I think they see that.
Well, you've totally won me over, right? I mean, reading the Sun Post seems like the absolute most important thing that the provost should do first thing in the morning. Right? Like,
oh, well, thank you.
No, but really, I mean, in order for me to obtain information about what students think of whether to accept a higher financial aid package from Vanderbilt or to go to a state school, most of the time, the best source for me is to try to read a Reddit thread, right? So the idea that students are actually engaging in deep investigative journalism about students' choices, about students' decisions, about students' vision and understanding of what's happening in the university, in a college, on campus, it's really an incredibly important reminder that students are doing that with a tremendous amount of support from faculty like you who are shaping the way in which they do it responsibly, they do it thoughtfully, they do it, as you say, from an inquiry-based perspective. It's a great reframe.
Thank you. I am excited to hear that because we essentially want to build what will be the Reuters and the CNN of youth news media. I think that in this moment, there's so much power and relevance to hear from the students who will be the majority voting body politic in the next presidential election, who are shaping this path for the future of our democracy, to hear from them and to train them up with a lot of integrity as storytellers. But I also am excited to build an audience for this that is certainly students, right? We want students to be reading each other's work. It's amazing to me that there's no aggregate of student newspapers in this country. It's why aren't we? This is this mother lode. It's a gold. I've hit this like vein of gold content and nobody's bringing it all together. So that was thrilling. But it's not just the students who should be reading students. It's the teachers and the parents and the grandparents and the neighbors who can learn from the students as they redefine journalism and hopefully bring it to a new level. But it's probable that maybe 20% max of the students we work with in our programming who are in these top newsrooms, student newsrooms nationally, 20% might go into the journalism profession. But the other 80% will go into public service. They will go into law. They will go into teaching. They will go into medicine.
Totally.
And the skills that they have learned from showing up in community, asking questions, considering different perspectives on the truth, synthesizing those into a narrative, will serve them as leaders in their industries. I mean, I actually met a student who was the editor-in-chief of her publication, and she is now a top surgeon. And she says that the skills I learned in interviewing and asking questions and cold calling,
taking initiative, being entrepreneurial,
state representative,
exactly,
was what made it possible for me to engage with colleagues in research, to engage with my patients.
Amazing, totally.
That is training.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a great place for me then to ask you, is that the space where you feel you have quantum potential or you're having the quantum impact that you would like to have in this time, in this moment, in your life, in our world, is this idea that you're training students, young adults, to be able to have that amazing sense of inquiry, that amazing sense of entrepreneurial spirit of really seeking multiple pieces of evidence and multiple ways to tell the story.
I think there's something even bigger, which is students can be essential to helping rebuild the decline of local news ecosystems. I cannot overstate the importance of local news in community and democracy in this moment, in the effort to build out common ground, build out goodwill, depolarize, rediscover the center in the United States. There's so much evidence that communities that have robust local coverage, local storytelling on the common ground, on the commons, on the local schools and parks and hospitals and streetlights, that is where we think as community members, as opposed to as warring factions, which is what's happening in national media. Local media is about what we share in common. National media is about what divides us. And as we see this extraordinary decline in local newspapers, the data is just, devastating. But you see high school after high school and university after university with all this great storytelling talent and all this great reporting talent, and deploying those students, that talent into the field, into the community meetings, and giving them the opportunity to help rebuild some of that. There's a quote from Steve Waldman I heard this weekend, who's a great leader in rebuilding local news networks. And he said, this is the work that helps us not just rebuild trust and engagement as, members of a local body politic, but it helps us move beyond the demonization of our neighbors, right? This is the struggle that we're all coming to terms with right now, whether it's around the climate issue, the environment issue, or in our political moment, is that we've lost the love your neighbor.
Yeah.
We've lost the ability
circle
to reconnect with each other. And I think local news, whether it's on TikTok, but hopefully with a fact-checking screen, or whether it's in the digital space, or it's a old printout publication, that kind of local news content, bringing students into that space, merging my work in student journalism with the leaders in local journalism, I think can have profoundly beneficial benefits to our democracy. And
I love that.
That is the quantum
That's
impact.
the quantum impact. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Remember to stay curious and keep exploring new ideas. We'll be back next season with another guest who's pushing the boundaries of discovery. Until then, I'm Sibel Raver, and this is Quantum Potential.
The Quantum Potential podcast comes from Vanderbilt University. Your host is C. Sibel Raver. Thank you to our guest, Amanda Little. Production by Matriarch Digital Media. For more information about Quantum Potential, go to vanderbilt.edu/quantum potential. Stay curious.